trying to find the window with Firefox. And go. All right. Hey, everyone. This is the SIG Auth meeting for September 18th, 2019. I don't see any announcements on the agenda, so I can hopefully assume that no one has anything particular they want to talk about. So I guess we can move on to issues. Who put the audit finding issue? Mike, was that you?
Yeah, I just this is more of an announcement if you want to subscribe. I'm not sure what the intent is versus the initial ones, but just kind of thought it might be interesting to the people here.
Yeah, there was a decent chunk of stuff. I guess I was happy to feel like the audit didn't find anything that was like completely broken. It's good. Yeah, I did enjoy reading through that, and I don't envy the task of looking at Cube and hoping to find something.
I hope it happens again.
Yeah. Do you know if there's actually any plans for another one?
Not that I know of.
Okay, cool. All right. Tim, did you want to talk about your KEP?
Yeah. So I'm proposing 3 additional restrictions that are enforced through the node restriction plugin for 117. So the 3 restrictions are on just a reminder, this applies to what kubelets or anything with a node identity is able to do in the cluster. And so these are kind of placing additional restrictions on editing and creating pods. The 3 restrictions are to labels, annotations, and owner references. And the reason is that there's a bunch of controllers in the cluster that match pods based on labels and owner references. And being able to edit those references can be used to manipulate those controllers to do things that the node shouldn't be able to do. If we're assuming kind of an isolated node threat model. So 2 examples are getting a pod to match a service that shouldn't be routing traffic to that node, which can be used for man in the middle, or making a pod match another a replica set or a stateful set or something that shouldn't be matched to that node, and that can be used for denial of service. There's probably other examples of non-core controllers that can be manipulated to do various things. So that's with labels and owner references, and then the assumption is that there could also be controllers looking at annotations for various extended behaviors. I don't have any concrete examples of that, but I also think that we should limit what the kubelet can do in terms of annotations for similar reasons. So that's kind of the high level. The more specific proposal is basically that labels and annotations be restricted to a whitelisted prefix, which is they have to start with unrestricted.node.kubernetes.io, just to indicate that these are labels and annotations that aren't restricted through node restriction. The motivation for that is that there are examples of static pods serving services in certain environments. I think OpenShift is one of them. And we want to make sure that there's a path forward for those models.
And then for the other labels, the ones that nodes apply to themselves, we didn't make any statements about labels outside the Kubernetes IO namespace. So nodes can still label themselves any way they want outside Kubernetes IO labels. Is there a reason that we didn't do something similar here?
So just to clarify, you're proposing that any labels that don't start with Kubernetes.io, some subpath, be unrestricted as well?
Possibly. I mean, the rationale was that Kubernetes shouldn't have opinions about non-Kubernetes labels.
Right. So going back to kind of the motivating examples of preventing services or pods from matching other services and controllers, I think it's pretty standard to have the labels on, matched by a replica set controller, for instance, on your deployment, be not in the Kubernetes.io domain. And so I think that allowing those labels would not really mitigate the threat without a lot of user education kind of push.
And this would be for a forked kubelet. Is there any way for a kubelet to add pods or add labels to pods that are where the labels are outside of the Kubernetes, this list right here? Config mirror, config hash. Does that happen today?
No, so that's another point, is that so there's two ways that the kubelet has of labeling pods. One is through kubelet doesn't actually have the update pod permission. It does have update pod status, which can change labels. The kubelet never does that today. And so that's another reason to restrict these, is that we're saying that this is behavior that the kubelet doesn't need. So we're just eliminating that. The other way that kubelet can add labels is through mirror pods, which are, for those who don't know, a mirror pod is sort of a reflection of a static pod that the kubelet is running through static configuration. So it's a pod that isn't created through the API server. It's created directly through the kubelet. And then the kubelet creates this mirror pod in the API server to indicate that this other pod is running locally. And so you could put any label you want on a mirror pod today. What this proposal is saying is that now you're only going to be able to create mirror pods with this, using this unrestricted.node.kubernetes.io label.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the owner reference bit is a lot more of a slam dunk. Like that one, especially for controller references, like it doesn't make any sense to have static pods that declare owner references to things with controller true set, because mirror pods aren't spawned by a controller resource. So like just flat out preventing that seems very sensible, and that would prevent kind of adoption by replica sets and or confusion of the controllers and things to think that these pods belong to them and have them go trigger deletion of other pods. That seems very clear. The annotation aspect seems really speculative. Like,
sorry, just to back up quickly, the owner reference would only block that if we require setting the owner reference. The current proposal says you can leave the owner references empty, but if you have one, you can only have this one.
And maybe this is even another thing, is like there's been a discussion in terms of fixing the fact that nodes don't actually use GC for pods. We have all sorts of like guarantee failures around nodes going away and coming back. There is a proposal that's I'm trying to shepherd through where it's likely that binding a pod, or in theory, binding a pod to a node is going to add an owner reference to that node with that UID. On the cluster side, But then we would definitely want to make sure that if a static pod came in, that it also had an owner ref to that node and that UID so that they're treated the same. So just a small wrinkle that I realized while we were talking about this.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so, sorry, Jordan, I cut you off about the labels piece.
Oh, no, just like in order of clearest win to most questionable, like the owner reference piece seems very clear.
Mm-hmm.
The labels things seem like there are demonstrated use cases where I know being able to label pods can cause problems. And then the annotations one, it sounds like is largely speculative. Like there may be
Yeah.
controllers that may be using annotations for things and we want to protect them.
Yeah.
Like what we did for other parts of node restrictions, the more speculative and sort of hand wavy, like there may be a third party controller doing a thing that we need to protect. The more speculative it got, the more we leaned on webhook admission. Like if someone has their own label that they really need to protect, they can set up a webhook admission plugin to protect it. I'm not sure if we want to do similar things here or around annotations and like non-Kubernetes labels.
So actually, when I initially wrote this proposal, I wasn't thinking about the other controllers. I was only looking at the man in the middle vector for services. And so the original proposal was an update to the endpoint controller that said just never match mirror pods or static pods. But I think the label restrictions are sort of a generalization of that applies to other controllers and at the same time solves the services problem. If we dropped the label restrictions from this proposal, I would want to make sure we have some other way of preventing the man in the middle attack on services.
For the kubelet, is there any path other than in the like default RBAC model for it to update labels and annotations other than the pod status path?
To update? No, it can create them on pods when it's creating mirror pods.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I mean, like, I understand that if I remember correctly, that behavior is there for backwards compatibility, but what you used to be able to do through status, do we need to maintain that for a kubelet? Like if this thing is turned on?
Yeah, that's a good point. We could say that for add additional restrictions, that kubelet status updates don't change any of the metadata.
I'm trying to think. I'm pretty sure there are places that are like piggybacking on kubelet credentials to do things like set annotations on update for network plugins.
Mm-hmm.
We can never win, can we?
Cool. Have a node really restriction admission plugin. All right. Yeah, I think outlining, like taking each of those, taking each of those aspects and kind of thinking through like what could this break and what is this clearly fixing and what is this speculatively fixing, that would maybe help prioritize them.
Cool. Does anyone have anything else before we move on? I realized I muted myself. I was asking, Mike, did you put the certificates cap on there? The retroactive one in the list?
Yes, I have addressed all comments. The one from you that says add a section on related projects, I had it and Jordan asked me to remove it in the initial KEP. I think that it is something that we can add later.
Yeah, I'm perfectly fine with that. It was more, I didn't even say add a section. It was, do you want one?
Yeah, I think we do want one.
We do want one. We want to backfill, like make it clear where we're at and like how we got where we're at, and then merge that, and then for the questions for V1, add that back in and talk through this.
On the how we got here, Mike, thanks for writing this out. Like this was like just good history. There's a lot of things that get lost in source code that are not obvious.
That's an old issue.
Yeah.
I had
alternatives. The things that didn't exist when this was made. Alternatives considered. Maybe in the future there will be a protocol.
Why didn't you use Acme? Well, because it happened a year after I made this.
They copied us. Just kidding.
That's right.
So if you guys want to take another pass, I just wanted to let you know that it's ready.
And so if I understand correctly, this is just meant to be, this is the initial state, we merge it as is, and then we start hammering on it to figure out the GA requirements?
Yep.
Cool. Okay, so I think, so the main thing left is, we got 117 stuff mostly. All right, so I know, Mike, you had quite a few things in there, and I feel like this list got longer. Maybe Tim, maybe you added some stuff in here. You guys want to talk about the various bits?
Yeah, I'll start with the first two. So I think token request endpoint is about ready for GA. The KEP is now merged. So I don't, I'll go through and add graduation requirements, but I don't think there's much other than make sure that we have testing and conformance testing. We already have end-to-end testing, so maybe add those to conformance testing.
Have there been any feature requests recently for this? I know I've seen some adopters. Like, is this widely adopted beyond you?
AWS uses it.
Yeah, I saw that one. Is there anybody, like, any feedback we need to gather from anyone, like, besides the cloud providers?
So what I know is that Istio and AWS are using it, and Linkerd has a bug to use it. I can go ahead and try to get a fuller list. That might be.
And I don't know that I would block it in 117 based on that, just as a, like, it always makes it feel much more warm and fuzzy when we're like, hey, we're going to GA and here's the feedback from the people who are happy with it. Just in the off chance somebody comes around and yells at us for, I don't know, doing things that help people.
Yes, right. And there is one feature request, which is the fifth item on this list, but I think that can be addressed separately from the GA.
I think there was one other, I don't know if this was totally settled, but the arbitrary claims was something that was also a feature request.
Yeah, that was my feature request, but I don't really have a need for it yet. So, I'm willing to drop that for the sake of GA.
I will note that, like, one of the original things that happened at the same time we started talking about token request, which was being able to inject tokens or secret credentials from other providers, with 116 and the external and the CSI local support in theory, it's possible to go write local agents that do injection. So, like, I don't know that that's something that we have to do for this KEP, but it might be might poke some people and see if their integration that they wanted to do historically that they couldn't is possible now using the CSI stuff. It doesn't have to block this, but it is that other part of the, I want to have a secret injected that's managed by the platform, that I can't corrupt, that I'm not the one running the agent to go do it. And the CSI external, or the CSI local volumes is in theory what was supposed to enable that.
Yeah, we had a presentation on a similar thing that to what you just described. I don't know if it used these tokens for anything yet. So are we actually passing, I think we used to do this for Flex Volumes. Are we passing tokens to CSI plugins?
No, you would have to, I was referring it more in the completely orthogonal case, which is
okay,
a privileged extension on the node that's allowed to segregate and isolate. So like a Kerberos ticket granting entity or a arbitrary private key minting plugin. I'm not sure that I'm sure there are people out there who will be doing that. I wonder if we could like send a call out, which is like, if anybody's using that for integrating security stuff, to let us know so that we can just take it into account. Again, it's not part of this and I wouldn't block anything on this, but.
Yeah, I think Deus has a project that is aligned with that, posted in the chat.
Yeah, the Vault guys are the obvious ones, but I think they just went for the completely orthogonal approach. And I don't know how excited they'd be to go write a bunch of code just to show that something's possible for us.
Hey guys, this is Jeff from Hoshi Corp.
And
hey. We would be super excited to write some code around that.
See, that warms my heart.
So we were actually, I was talking to Rita Zhang about this yesterday. And one of the reasons I joined the call today was to chat about exactly this. And sorry, my dog's playing with a squeaky toy behind me, so that's great. Okay, so yeah, if we, if we want to have some questions we had actually was like, is there an RFC process for doing this? And, what do you guys expect from us in terms of like putting together a proposal? Or do you just want to side channel this stuff?
It depends on what you want to do. So I think there are a couple things that you've been working on related to Kubernetes. One is, do you already have a CSI driver that integrates with Deus Lab Secret Store?
So we are actually, Deus Labs is donating, since one of our engineers paired up with Deus on writing the provider for that CSI driver for Vault. We're going to be adopting that code base into a Hoshi Corp repo, or at least the Vault provider part of the code base. And that's specifically what we're talking about here.
Right. There's the other thing, which is the Kubernetes auth backend for Vault, which currently doesn't support these new tokens. So I think that is somewhat related and could also be a way to contribute and get mileage on the token request feature that we're talking about.
Cool. And with the token request feature, I think the primary problem that we have today with how it's implemented is like, at least the provider uses the service account, its own service account, not necessarily the service account of the pod that it's servicing. Does that make any sense?
Yes.
So we need it to be, ideally it would be the pod's service account. And so would this allow us to do that?
I think that I looked somewhat recently. There were some minute things that needed some work. One was the issuer URL is hard-coded to the legacy token issuer URL. So that needs to be configurable. The other thing was that it would be nice to support in audience configuration. So so Vault could use a token that was not replayable against the Kubernetes API server. As far as the service account of the Vault credential plugin. I think you need that to do the token reviews that you're currently doing today. That could probably be a bit simpler if you used in-cluster config. So you run Vault as a pod, and then Vault uses the credentials that are automatically injected into the pod. We have some support for that in our client Go, which I don't think that you are currently using today because it's a headache. And I think you probably still want what you have today, where you configure a separate kubeconfig, just in case somebody wants to run Vault outside of Kubernetes, but still wants to use the Kubernetes auth provider.
Okay, cool. So this is, really appreciate all this, Michael. Is there as far as like contributing this code and stuff, do you want to have a separate discussion about that? Or is there like, what's the best way to draw up proposals and stuff?
Yeah, if you want, I can file an issue with some of those findings in the Vault Kubernetes auth repo. That's for project 2, and then project 1, it sounds like it is already underway. The secret store CSI volume.
That sounds right to me. Okay, cool.
I'll add an AI to do that. And for moving on to the second 117 feature, it's the volume projection part of this. I think this is potentially less ready to go GA. There are numerous issues with the replacing the Kubernetes service account token that is automatically injected by the service account admission controller. The volume projection works fine for what it does. However, it is not currently ready to replace the old secret volumes. So I think that it would be nice to have a little better understanding of how we would replace those secret volumes before taking the volume projection to GA. But that's probably something I'm going to start thinking about, at least draft the GA graduation requirements during 117 cycle.
I would also recommend prioritizing the client library refresh behavior, just because like if we can do that as soon as possible and give that, multiple releases to kind of percolate out to people's projects. I know it's shocking, but most people don't update their client libraries every 3 months. So the longer we can give that to soak and get out there, the better. Even if the answer ultimately is you need to be using a client library that was made within the last year, like that's a better story than you need to update your client library every 3 months.
Yes, I agree. I think that the JavaScript client made a little progress recently, but I can go.
Yeah, so if we actually want to link those in, that would be a great way to like shard out effort if people want to jump in and help and kind of take a look at what we spec'd out for client Go and bite off one of the issues for one of the language libraries.
Yep, I definitely agree.
What's the current status there? Like Go's done, right? Is it just the long tail of other languages?
Go's been done for actually a fairly long time, and we still are seeing issues with things like Calico and old versions of Heapster, and even Heapster is a project that we have in Kubernetes org, but stuff like the cluster proportional autoscaler, which is a Kubernetes incubator project, was broken until fairly recently.
I literally just updated the Haketi plugin to use current client libraries, it was on version 3 previously, which is like 2.5, 3 years old. So just a data point, a horrible, horrible data point.
Yeah, I saw some of those bugs. I guess like the what was I going to say now? I forgot.
Yeah, I think the what we've done in past releases is have new behavior, like make sure there are E2E tests for it, and then with at least a couple releases notice, flip the default, but then have a way for people to like get back to the previous behavior and leave it in that state for a while. And just flipping the defaults for the ecosystem does wonders in like, you know, people who have a cluster that they're managing can put it back to the old defaults and run using, you know, old tried and true methods for multiple releases. But as soon as the default changes, the people who maintain the long tail of components in the ecosystem start getting reports of like, hey, I spun up a developer cluster and your thing didn't work. And here's a bug report. And maybe you should update your libraries to be within the last 2 years.
Yeah, now I remember my question. Like, did we actually write like docs that include like example error messages that people could find with search engines? And like, I know at one point I was pointing people to like a PR by Mike where he changed a bunch of stuff and was like, do this. I don't know if like the docs got better in the meantime or if like they still need to be improved because that probably should also happen.
Yeah, docs for people who are updating their client libraries or docs for people who are trying to figure out where an error message came from?
Yeah, a bit of both. So like, yeah, I got this error message or like, yeah, it's kind of, it's a little tricky, I think, because it's not like an obvious error message, but like we can make some educated guesses that might lead people to the right place.
Yeah, it might also be worth adjusting the service account token authenticator to produce a more helpful error message. Like you are using an awesome service account token that happened to expire, which means you didn't pull the, like, give them hints instead of just
right,
not valid after, go away.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, well, I think documenting in a few different dimensions there would be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So in relation to like, you know, expiring tokens and stuff, right? Like once people kind of get used to like infinitely long tokens, right? You know, get this permanent behavior of I read it once on process start and I never read it again. What are you, like, what's the criteria for maybe like enough of the ecosystem is doing better, right? Like do we have like a measurable thing to say that enough things have caught up now that we could reasonably try to change the default, even if you can switch it back to the old behavior?
We should, as part of graduation criteria, have some vague understanding of what we're waiting for as far as community adoption. I don't really have a good idea of what I would put there today.
Yeah. It's weird because this one is like a scale problem too. So like there may be some audiences that we could pitch this at. So anybody who has lots of namespaces would want this. Well, I'm assuming the token request is actually more performant than our current secret storage path, which is entirely possible. It's not. Mike, actually, how far has this been pushed so far? Do you know if anybody's pushed this to tens of thousands of namespaces and service accounts?
It is used. There's CubeMark, which
is it in the 5,000 node test? Are we exercising any part of it?
I think I added it to all CubeMark.
Because I certainly know, like from the OpenShift, like high density, high multi-tenant one, this is one that like is really exciting to push. So like anybody who's in a high density spot might just want something like this, as long as it doesn't fall apart in the other one. So they might be someone that we could, you know, pitch this as like, hey, if you're running high scale Kubernetes, you should consider enabling this and be our guinea pigs.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's still the config map per namespace that it creates, but it might not be really consequential.
The config map you're talking about is the one that has the trust chain for it?
Yeah, the root CA.
That might actually be worse than the current one.
Secrets were a lot worse for a long time.
Yeah.
But that was improved. Now there's only one secret per namespace versus one secret per service account, but we basically swapped a secret for a config map.
There was definitely a discussion about this on that came up a while back, which would be, should we begin looking at gzipping some of these things in the storage layer? And the problem with CAs is that they don't compress well except against each other. So there has been some crazy things suggest there. I guess if it's not really a net win, then maybe the scale guys aren't going to be excited. But there are definitely people who have lots of service accounts. So
Tim also has a proposal for a certificate bundle type support, which could turn out to be a cluster level object.
Or a virtual resource per namespace that dynamically maps those in.
That would also work.
I had one thought about like the question about metrics. If we want people to, like, there are benefits to getting onto these tokens, even aside from the refresh every 10 minutes aspects, like credentials that are bound to the lifetime of a pod. And so as soon as the pod goes away, that credential is no longer good.
Yep. Security conscious people.
And the ability to attribute a request to a given pod, like a credential to a given pod. If we had a way to switch onto the new tokens, but with a longer lifetime, and then have metrics around whether clients were correctly refreshing. So if we continued refreshing, every 10 minutes, but just minted tokens with longer lifetimes, then we would be able to tell if these workloads were correctly refreshing or not by continued use of tokens past 10 minutes, right? And so that wouldn't disrupt anything. And as soon as the pod got deleted, you'd get the revocation benefits. And then you could have metrics around like, hey, you've switched to these new tokens. Here's all the pods and all the namespaces that aren't refreshing correctly. Like, go fix those things. And then once all your workloads and all your pods were happy, then you could crank down the lifetime to the 10-minute lifetime. I don't know.
That is a good idea.
I really like that. That does not sound like you'll completely trash everyone's stuff.
I mean, don't get me wrong. Completely trashing everyone's stuff is sometimes necessary, but maybe in this case it's not.
Yeah, we've done some similar things with certificates here where, we wanted to test out our refreshing logic, but not have everything break. So we gave them long lifetimes, but refresh them kind of more than they needed to.
So would those metrics sort of be emitted by like the service account token authenticator just during the validation process?
Yeah, maybe, probably so.
Yeah.
So that seems like a second arg to the API server that says continue refreshing every 10 minutes, or let kubelets refresh every 10 minutes, but mint for longer, and like warn if you see things past this time period. I don't know. I really want to be able to roll this out, but I want to be able to do it with data that says that it's safe to roll out.
Yeah. Thanks for all the feedback, but I think that we probably spent enough time on this one. We should probably move on.
All right. Dynamic audit.
Dynamic audit's the next discussion topic on the agenda. So maybe let's pause this and just let's see. We already talked about extended node restrictions for pods. I'd still like to try and resolve the feedback and get this into 1.17 as an alpha. And I'll let someone else talk about the next two.
Yeah, it looks like we have everybody here for this one. I think there was like a last comment from Clayton about,
It was one of those death comments from Clayton.
yeah.
What?
So
No.
It was. It totally was.
Someone on this call who is not me may or may not have sent me a link to this and made a comment. So I will keep that person nameless and take all blame. Yeah, I apologize for the death comment on this. It wasn't my intent.
It's fine. He's talking about me. I will take it. It's fine.
I love gRPC. I am not sure that gRPC is our most successful extension mechanism. But if like, and so that was where my concern was just adding more and more of those without like a little bit of a like soul searching on, are we succeeding with the goals we have for all the other ones? So
can you offer an alternative?
I did at the time. I've forgotten because this was way outside my cache. I'll have to go to disk. Mo, do you remember what we talked about then?
Nope, it's too long, dude. This is in June.
I think the concern before was that if it was about rereading, like for rotation, why not just reread from disk?
Yeah.
But I think the core concern here is not just the rotation, but also moving the signing out of the API server.
This is the similar motivation for the KMS plugin for storage encryption.
The KMS one is a little special because if you compromise that, you root the whole cluster, or it's in that same vein. This one is two. I will say, so the other thing, like and the thought that I think led to this, if I'm starting to remember a little bit, is like doing these kinds of plugins on masters is really, really complicated because everybody's masters are different. And so having masters call out to extensions has always been somewhat problematic. And so I think there's certainly people who are totally fine with it. And maybe that the set of people who would do this overlap with the kinds of crazy people who do KMS plugins in very opinionated installs.
Yeah, even beyond the threat of a compromised master, I think there's value in using robust key management systems for stuff like auditing and rotation calendars that we probably will not implement. So I guess there are two questions. Is this useful? And then the second question is, if so, what mechanism do we use to extend the API server?
On this one, do we feel the same need that we felt for KMS to have like gRPC? Like if I understood correctly, for the KMS stuff, we really wanted like a Unix domain socket, so that way you kind of didn't have to do authentication on it. You basically knew it was the Kube API server talking to you on that domain socket. And once it connected, you couldn't disconnect it without causing audit events in the kernel. Do we have the same desire here?
Those are all nice properties of it. I think that it is, I don't know, Micah wrote the proposal, so maybe you can comment. My guess is that Micah was thinking that there's not a better alternative, and this is what we've done for other similar extensions. So
it is at least analogous to a callback style pattern for some of this, because we're not storing. The whole goal of this is not to store the tokens in etcd. So like the controller pattern is straight out, and I think most of my concerns that we talked about at the time was more about complexity. Although, like whenever someone suggests gRPC, I'd say, like even the kubelet, like I think cryo CRI has not been as good of an extension mechanism for the node as it could have been if it was the opposite pattern. But that's a much bigger arc. We don't have a lot of other examples where we've said we have an extension that's not just reading a file off of disk, that's not a controller pattern, that's not gRPC. So like, at least from that perspective, it's not crazy.
Yeah, I think the alternatives that I can think of are a webhook style thing, like we do for token review, for example, gRPC or PKCS11. And the imperative callback style APIs, we've gone with gRPC in the past.
And the novel thing about webhooks is that webhooks are transferring Kubernetes objects in almost every case, or they're a complete opaque content payload. Actually, I don't know if there was like readiness probes or like the other example of like, it is effectively a zero implementation. There's no data payload. I would agree for anything that's not a Kube API object or.
So we could
is more
proxy the token. We could proxy the token request object. Where that gets complicated is the authentication paths.
Yeah, I don't know that it's superior to gRPC. And the point about your other properties is fine, I guess. Do we think that this would be something that you would host remotely, significantly far away from a cluster?
What is significantly far away?
Far enough away that you are going to feel like it's likely to be outside of the domain. So like another argument about webhooks is that you can very easily do things like serverless implementations of them, and you can't do a serverless gRPC implementation, period. I mean, I guess you can, but like, so we had, at least for webhooks, discussed the idea that, you know, you could run any backend that can deal with Kube API objects, versus this is a little bit more specific, which is, do we really need do we want to make it super easy for people to go write these plugins? And I realize my comment is almost exactly the opposite of that, but like, I think it's a reasonable point that if we're going to pick something and it's not a Kube object and we don't intend people to go be able to just do it in any language they want, because we're trying to, like, it's a super, there'll be tons of people writing these plugins, then gRPC is our default answer.
I might need to stop this one so we can get to the audit policy stuff. I sense a pretty high level of contention still on this. Like,
so I will say my comment, I rescind from the perspective of, if you can't just do it with a file on disk, do not invent something other than gRPC for this use case. So I think that aligns pretty well with the RFC, but then the other part of it, I have no opinion on.
All right, well, we can follow up on the issue. Thank you, everyone.
all right, we have 8 or so minutes left. We can skip this, it's fine. Jordan, please let me deprecate ABAC, please. And then, Tim, did you want to talk about dynamic audit now?
I'll let Georgie take this one.
Yeah, I'm here. If you want, I can take over. Can you hear me, guys?
Yep.
Cool. Okay. So condense this because we are pressed in time. You know, audit policy has been hanging for quite some time, but I believe that now we've progressed quite well. We basically had to gather more user stories and roles and so on, and dig a little bit deeper into this stuff so we can really elaborate a design based on concrete needs. And I think we are somewhere there. So right now, you see the shared document. It's been shared since Friday, and I've set a due date until this Friday, so that we can time box the whole exercise and actually move to the next step, which, as advised, is going to be a CAP with the warnings from this document that I'm going to put out. Then again, I'm not sure. Probably we need another one that's going to be sort of umbrella cap, because I see this as integral part of the whole audit sync topic. So maybe we need to advance both together to beta and so on. So maybe I need also an umbrella cap. Do I? Or that can be decided after that. But in any case, what I wanted to do here is actually to make a brief overview, which I'll skip now because we really don't have the time for this. You can read it in the document. It should be pretty comprehensive in these terms. I just want to give a heads up that it's also it's first of all, it's coherent with all the concepts that we know from the legacy policy file and also from other resource selection models like Airbag and so on, but it takes a kind of different approach at realizing these things. So there are things that are completely new. Just as a teaser, for example, we skip stages as a concept inside, as an explicit concept, I mean. Internally, they're still supported. So I would urge you to take a look and see if something really bothers you here, or if you want to add some more context. But in any case, leave your opinion, because I really strive to move things forward after opinions are gathered with this document to a pull request and also to a cap.
So I wanted to ask, I think this was slightly discussed. If the dynamic audit policy is going with a very different structure of API, right, than versus the one that's on disk, right? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah.
Right. So are we just gonna, like, is there a desire to try to have some level of compatibility, or is just basically we learned some stuff from the original approach and we don't want to carry it all forward? Like we don't want all the tech debt of that. We want the better one, and we'll write good docs and hope you can understand the difference.
Yeah, I can take this. I think there's kind of two big differences between what we had before and this. The one we had before was optimized for writing a single static file. It also wasn't an actual API object, so it didn't go through API review and had a few inconsistencies there. So with the new dynamic policy, one, it tries to fix some of those API inconsistencies and kind of clean up some stuff, eliminating the tech debt you referred to. The other thing that it really changes is it's optimizing for policies to be extended and reused, whereas before you just had one single file sort of statically edited by an administrator or something. Now you could have multiple audit endpoints, and we want to be able to reuse parts of the policy between those endpoints without needing to maintain a bunch of copies with possibly slight differences. So that's a bit on like the motivation for some of the changes. Now there is a question sort of going forward, do we want to bring these changes back to the static piece? In some cases, I think the answer is yes. I'm not sure in all cases. I don't think that we should optimize for that at this stage, but I definitely think it's something that we should look into maybe once the audit policy goes to beta, how to reconcile those better.
Is it possible to, like, if someone wanted to, like, are the APIs close enough that you could theoretically write like a little tool that took your file and turned it into like an okay-ish version? That's the dynamic API. Like if you kind of wanted to just migrate yourself off and be like, I want to use the new one.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Yeah, the two transformer will actually, we will in the implementation transform this API to the legacy model so that we can support one model internally only. So they're automatically translatable to each other.
So one question I have is, what happens when I turn both these things on at the same time? Is that answered in this design?
Yeah, it should be. If it's not, please give me heads up.
It's
So
27 pages long. Do you mind pointing me in it?
it's the document is a link in the meeting minutes.
Yeah,
So
the
you can
doc
take
is
it from.
27 pages long. I was hoping you would have a section titled "What happens when I turn both of these on?"
By
Okay,
these,
so
do you mean the dynamic endpoints and the static endpoints?
Yeah, because it's going to be an upgrade path thing, right? Where you upgrade it, you'll have your static file, the API will be available for adding dynamic audit policy. Someone adds it, what do we expect to have happen? I'd like to see that as an upgrade concern that gets listed here, just to make sure we handle it.
okay, that's definitely is going to be in the KIP.
The static path should continue to be supported in parallel with the dynamic one. But I agree that there are some concerns around how the upgrade works. But that might also be covered in the current dynamic audit proposal or KEP. I don't think it's anything new with the new policy design.
It is covered, though the ability to have different policy for the dynamic webhooks syncs makes that have more questions around how it works.
Yeah, agreed.
Cool. So we have about 30 seconds left. Does anyone want to say anything? Because there's not enough time for a new topic. Cool. Well, thank you, everyone. That was a really good meeting, and we'll see you guys in 2 weeks.
Oh, one more thing, that OIDC issuer URL, if you guys, I just wanted to announce it, and I'll move it to the next meeting's agenda. All right.
It looks like the link is not correct.
Oh, no. All right, I'll fix the link and
Yeah.
we'll talk about the next meeting.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. All right. Take care, guys.